Okay. Greetings everyone and assalamu alaikum. All right. It is a pleasure to present this paper at this notable conference. And should I say that the outset that I'm sharing today is one part of a larger ongoing research project rather than the project and in its entirety. So what I will be doing in this presentation is laying out the conceptual and scholarly terrain that informs the project um, in terms of how certain ideas have been framed, debated, and constrained across different contexts. So this is very much about positioning rather than about outcomes or interventions. With this, I will move fairly directly into the field itself. So my paper or my project will be exploring the erotic aesthetics in the 120 Days of Sodom by Marquis de Sade and its implications for Malaysian tertiary English literature. So across literary history, erotic aesthetics has occupied a rather paradoxical position. They are persistently censored, morally contested, and institutionally marginalized, and yet they are repeatedly returned to as theoretically indispensable. So, which reminds me of a mother to her child. All right, when a mother says something, tells the child not to do something, the child will do it. All right, if when she tells the child not to read that book, the child will read that book. So, I'd say to summarize the the reason why erotic aesthetics has been has existed for such a long time, and this is among many reasons, is because of humans' curiosity towards the subject. All right, and so what's important here is that scholars do not generally treat erotic writing simply as a genre or a thematic category, as what most may think or believe. Instead, it tends to be approached as a critical site, a place where questions of ethics, um, normativity, and power over bodies becomes unusually visible. For instance, during intercourse or intimate intercourse or sex, what actions are permissible, regardless of regardless of the person being the dominant figure or the submissive figure. All right. In this sense, erotic aesthetics function less as a content and more as a method because it allows us, all right, to see how literary meaning is regulated, how representation is disciplined, and how certain forms of expressions are rendered um, acceptable or unacceptable within particular social and institutional frameworks. So, and it is also within this methodological understanding of erotic aesthetics that the figure of Marquis de Sade repeatedly appears. So de Sade, as to those who are familiar with his works and his theories or his characteristics, is almost always situated within Enlightenment discourse, but not as a straightforward participant or blunt participant in Enlightenment humanism. He expresses uh, his he expresses a subject, all right, for instance, fascism, through explicit content or explicit stories, all right, or words or lexicons, all right. So instead, dominant scholarship frames him, all right. So dominant scholarship, most scholarships frames him as a radical inversion of Enlightenment ideals, where God is absent, innate morality is denied, and desire becomes sovereign. So what scholars tend to emphasize is that this is not a rejection of reason itself, but rather an internal critique of rationalism. Because De Sade pushes Enlightenment logic to such an extreme that its ethical foundations begin to collapse. Moving on, all right. Um, Again, to those who are familiar with De Sade's characteristics, should know very clearly, all right, in the scholarship is that De Sade is constantly, or should I say consistently, um, framed to pornography. All right. So while I'd say, or should I say, this study does not deny the extremity of the material, but Dusat is almost always framed as a structural rather than gratuitous. Gratu- uh, Gratuitous, yes, that's the correct word. So the shock is doing the conceptual work. All right, Dusat's writing is understood as philosophical provocation and ethical destabilization, um, like the systematic engagement with extremity designed to test the limits of moral reasoning itself. So the question becomes not why the text is disturbing, but what disturbance is made to do. Okay, so moving on to the fifth slide, we need this study now turns to the narrative architecture of the 120 Days of Sodom. So from here, we get to understand the internal mechanics of this text, all right? Because most studies constantly highlight its close spatial design and rigid narrative organization. The four libertines are widely read as symbolic representatives of institutional power, aristocracy, judiciary, clergy, and finance, while the victimized bodies are theorized as governed subjects rather than individual characters. So what matters here in his architecture, in Dusart's architecture, is not about realism but structure, how power is formalized, regulated, and enforced through its narrative design. Now, a particular influential framework in this discussion is the Kant with Sade axis. All right, Kant with Sade axis. So the Lacanian scholarship draws a parallel or agrees with Kant's categorical imperative and Sade's systemization of desire, showing how desire is transformed into universal law. This parallel is used to demonstrate how rationality, once absolutized and detached from ethical restraints, somehow becomes a mechanism of domination rather than moral guidance. Across these readings, all right, we need readers, or this study explores that sexuality in the 120 Days of Sodom is shouldn't not be analyzed only through the lens of intimacy, but also through the lens of the ruling language. So the two structural positions that consistently recur in the scholarship are those who command and those who submit. Hence, in this scenario, sex becomes a mechanism through which hierarchy is enforced and maintained. So, what or what this study emphasize here is that intimacy is displaced by governance and desire. Hence, desire becomes administrative rather than relational. So by diving into the narrative logic, another key observation observes how the text um by diving into the narrative logic, it allows this study explores how this text directs the reader's attention. So the study notes that the deliberate narrowing of focus, encouraging selective identification with particular desires, um, For instance, where moral judgment is reframed as preference and ethical evaluation is displaced by aesthetic choice. This produces a form of ethical distancing where judgment is deferred rather than resolved, and hence creates a, a disagreement, all right, within among the readers, all right, or conflict between de Sade and his audience. The second logic of this entire narrative can should is interpreted through the centrifugal access, all right, where the text operates through access, in short. So the encyclopedic cataloging of acts and the four escalating phases of passions are widely read as methodical rather than chaotic. Access becomes classificatory, transgression is ordered, enumerated, and systematized. In this sense, extremity functions epistemologically because it produces knowledge rather than disorder. So as we move on, this leads to a broader synthesis in the scholarship. Because drawing on the principle that philosophy must say everything, scholars argue, or this study argues or notes, that repetition functions as calibration rather than redundancy, and narration becomes experimental procedure. Erotica in this framework operates as a controlled philosophical method rather than a narrative indulgence. So de Sade is never comfortably canonized, but we must understand he is never fully excluded either. Scholarship oscillates between moral condemnation and aesthetic valorization, and this oscillation becomes central to debates about canon formation and the ethical limits of literature. Interestingly, some of the most compelling analysis focus on what the text does not describe. For instance, scholars or most de Sade scholarships draw attention to narrative silence and elision. All right, moments where the most extreme acts are displaced into sealed or private spaces. These moments intensify um, ethical disturbance because they implicate the reader without offering descriptive resolution. Okay, so now we'll dive into the Malaysian tertiary literature and its policy landscape. And we must understand that this global scholarly backdrop, it is against this global scholarly backdrop that the Malaysian tertiary English literature context becomes significant, because existing studies note how curricula are shaped by religious, cultural, and political sensitivities. This produces a pedagogy of caution characterized by careful text selection and institutional self regulation. And hence, it is within this context, difficult themes are often neutralized, abstracted, or avoided altogether because texts are vetted for ideological resonance, and engagement with transgression tends to remain at the level of thematic reference rather than sustained analysis. What's striking, um, however, is that while these constraints are well documented, there is very little theorization of what exclusion itself means pedagogically. Boundary text that functions as ethical or aesthetic limit cases are largely absent from Malaysian tertiary literature scholarship, both in practice and in theory. And because of this absence constitutes the central gap identified here. So, taken together, all right, why de Sade appears in global literary scholarship? So, because it functions as a boundary text, ethical stress test, and a theoretical limit case. So, what I've aimed to do is clarify how a field has structured its thinking around transgression, exclusion, and pedagogy. And before we can ask what should be taught, we need to understand, or I'd say what Malaysia needs to understand, all right, is how scholarship has theorized um, what gets excluded and why. And yes, thank you.